And now we want to get a view from on high, as it were, from here in Washington, D.C. with Phil Limper. But before I turn it over to Phil, I just want to tell our local audience here, feel free to write down questions. We want to hear from you. I think some of the most interesting questions have been coming from the audience. Phil, take it away with your panel.
Thank you, Claire. And also, I've got to say, and just add, being the grandson of a dairy farmer, it's a privilege to be here and really have this open dialogue taking place. And when we look at Washington, and the theme of our session here is the view from 30,000 feet, I would suggest that a lot of people would say that it all starts and ends here in Washington, that both the opportunity and the challenges and maybe the problems are right here. So I'm looking forward to this panel being among the most controversial and really getting to the root of the issues. I want to introduce our panel, starting from my left, Dr. Jason Clay, who's the Senior Vice President, Market Transformation of the World Wildlife Fund. Then Kathy Block, the Director of Strategic Partnerships from the American Humane Association. And then Bob Stallman, Texas farmer and rancher, the President of the American Farm Bureau Federation and the Chairman of USFRA. And then John Scholl, the President of the American Farmland Trust. And then Frank DePasquale, the CEO of the School Nutrition Association. And then Trey Bailey, the Director of Agriculture and Food of Walmart. And then last but not least, we have Dan Glickman, the Senior Fellow, Bipartisan Policy Center, and former Secretary of Agriculture. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I want to go and start off with our panel discussion. And take a look at what we found in our nationwide survey. 93% of consumers care some or a lot about food prices and where that's going. 54% say they're dissatisfied with how farmers and ranchers are currently addressing the rising food prices. 95% of farmers and ranchers say that it's important they provide wholesome food to feed the world's population. We're also going to be taking questions here from our website, fooddialogues.com, and Claire will be looking at our social media questions as well. I guess the top line panel, our challenge here is to answer the question, if we look at our growing population worldwide, how are we going to feed everybody? I've also asked our panel to be no holds barred, to build on each other, and to feel free to disagree with each other as well. And when we look at situations like that, what's so critical is to understand what consumers are thinking about. So starting with our first question, and Jason, let me start with you. Rising population, dirtier air, dirtier water, less land, less people who want to be farmers. How do we make it all work?
I think we have to realize that we live in a global food system. The U.S. produces a lot of food, but we also, by value, import as much food as we produce domestically. So we can't take ourselves out of a global economy in this sense. The food dialogues like this are great because it lets us begin to ask questions about where our food comes from, how is it produced, does the planet support these kinds of production systems. For me, the issue is how to think about food, not what to think about it. And we need to start realizing that there's no silver bullet going forward. We're going to have 2 billion more people. They're going to have 2.9 times as much income. They're going to consume twice as much food. To put that another way, in the next 40 years, we've got to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. On a finite planet. We've got to produce more with less. Less land, less water, less fertilizer, less chemicals. We've got to intensify production. If we want to have any biodiversity left, if we want to have any natural ecosystems, wetlands, forests, etc., we have got to double up on production. We simply cannot expand farming onto the rest of the planet as we have for the last hundreds and thousands of years. So that's the challenge before us, and I hope we can dig into that a little bit more. What the world is looking for from the U.S. is innovation. And I think we have to look at our own food system and see, is this the structure that's going to really lead to innovation globally? And I think the issue that I would raise about innovation and the cautionary tale is, do subsidies contribute to innovation or not?
So Kathy, having heard what you just did. Where does the humane treatment of animals and people fall in this challenge?
Well, thank you for the question. It's what American Humane is about, the protection of children and animals. I think your point is very well taken, Jason, but as we take technology and we take science, we want to be sure we take some of the social values, and that is the welfare of animals, because it indeed contributes not only to the safety of the food, but to the quality of the food. And how we raise animals says a lot about, I think, the production that we will have throughout the world and the influence that we can make upon the world. I might add that as consumers, the gentleman farmer in Indiana referenced what are consumers thinking and are they going to change? He brought that up in a forum yesterday. As consumers go forward and we talk to them, their expectations about where their food comes from, how good it is for them, how good it is for the planet, I think we have to be, they have to expect that those expectations are going to cost more. And I think that's a part of what I hope these dialogues will be able to do, is to explain to people why, when you meet those kinds of expectations, you're not just providing a meal, but you're providing their social expectations that it will cost more to feed people.
Bob, I want you to wear your farmer rancher hat to answer the question. How do we deal with this growing population and feeding not only America, but the world?
Well, I think Jason laid out the challenge very ably. And the way we're going to have to deal with it to meet the constraints that are on this earth is through the use of technology. Now, a lot of the food debate that has been occurring in this country has been about the technologies that we're using now, the practices that we're using to meet the needs of the current population, and we'll have to expand on that greatly to meet the needs of the world by the time we get to 2050. And the dialogues are going to give us a real opportunity to have a talk about that. In addition, we have to talk about the marketplace and economics and prices. You know, consumers perhaps don't like high prices. I don't like high prices in the grocery store. But the reality is somehow the marketplace has to figure out a way to support the production of all the food that will be necessary by the time we get to that 2050 date.
Now, John, I get a lot of phone calls and emails from farmers who are struggling, that they're not making ends meet, they're looking at selling this beautiful property for condos so that their families can have money to live on. So how do we balance that with this huge challenge that we have about doubling food production?
Well, obviously it's a very complex set of issues that are in play here, and I think some of the panelists have indicated some of the opportunities we have to see this happen. I tend to go back to a fairly basic level and say that we really need to pay attention to that land resource, because that really is the fundamental basis of the productivity we have in American agriculture. And as my organization has pointed out quite strongly many times, we've lost 23 million acres in the last 25 years of farmland, and it's not always marginal farmland. Half of that generally is prime farmland that's the best at meeting the production needs that we're going to have to meet into the future. People have said we've doubled food production in the last 50 years. It's been well articulated. We're going to have to double food production in the next 50 years. I don't think we can assume that the answers that have helped us meet the challenge of the last 50 years are going to be the same as what we're going to have to do in the next 50 years. We're going to have to pay more attention to some things that, quite frankly, we've often taken for granted, protecting the land base being one of those. In the future, we're going to have more resource challenges. There's going to be less water. We're going to have to pay attention to the farmland. We have changing public attitudes in terms of how people look at some of the political and policy issues that's going to affect our ability to meet that challenge. And so I think it is going to be a very different picture, and we're going to have to go back and take a pretty basic look at some issues that we've pretty much taken for granted.
Now, Frank, I'd like you to look at this and put on your hat, obviously leading the schools in the nation with the challenges that they've got, but also from your retail experience. What's going to happen when we have to put into the system twice as much food for twice as many people? Does the system for distribution just blow up?
Well, it's not just food. It's not just feeding people, but it's about health and nutrition as well. You know, our diets are changing. We're all fighting, and I think we're doing a pretty good job, but a lot of work left to be done on childhood obesity. We have the dietary requirements that are changing and improving. So our diets are changing as well. kids in school, and we've been working very hard at having them eat more fresh fruit and vegetables. That's been improving. So it's not just about feeding people, and that's important, but it's also about health and nutrition. If you look at the National School Lunch Program, there's 31 million children every day are part of the National School Lunch Program. 11 million children every day part of the school breakfast program. 65% of those are free and reduced price meals. And that number increases, of course, because of the economy.
So Trace, from your standpoint, describe to us what Walmart, leading retailer, is doing to manage and help this growing population and reduced resources.
Thanks, Phil. As a growing global retail company with more than 9,000 stores in 28 countries around the world, certainly the largest grocer here in the United States, these are issues we're grappling with now because we can't afford for them to become a bigger problem in the future. It's interesting, your survey showed that customers far and away are concerned by price and the cost of food. Our own consumer insight shows just that customers are always sensitive to how much food costs. But what's really important, I think, in today's dialogue is it can't come at any cost. Consumers are never going to compromise, as you all know, on food safety, but consumers aren't going to compromise on the healthfulness of their products, and they're not going to compromise on the ethics of the products. And so some things we're working on at Walmart, we see ourselves as a convener. We have an opportunity now to bring together the best minds in industry, the best minds in academia, the best minds in the agriculture, production, supply chain to really grapple with some of these challenges that we have around environmental sustainability and around the healthfulness and the sourcing of the products that we have on our shelves. A couple of things we've done in the last year, launched a major nutrition initiative to help pull out some of the sodium and trans fats and added sugars in the foods that our customers want, because customers wanted to eat healthy, but they just needed a little bit of help doing it. We're helping put some icons on packages to help customers identify what's healthier. And moreover, we're working to bring down the price of these better-for-you products because customers are going to continue to demand that they can't compromise on price and nutrition and some of these other things.
So Dan, I picked you for last for a reason. For 6 years, you were the man. You've heard... No longer the man. No longer the man. So now you can say anything you want.
That's right.
So now you've heard all of these folks and their positions and what the challenges are. As an insider in Washington for many years, is it doable? Can we do what Jason is suggesting? Can we do what Frank is suggesting? Or are we just fooling ourselves?
No, first of all, I think the panel shows that these issues are very important. I'm reminded when I was on the House Agriculture Committee in the 18th century, we used to have these discussions about consumer issues and food safety and a lot of conservation issues. And the word on the committee was we got to keep those people out of our sandbox because this is the farmer's sandbox and nobody else's. And that's changing, and that's good because food issues are as important as energy issues, health care issues, other national security issues. So these are now becoming elevated in people's minds. That's important. That helps producers. It also helps consumers. And besides, they're important because we have to feed ourselves and feed the world and do it in a way that's predictable so that we don't have unstable conditions around the world because of lack of food. So I think these dialogues are great. I co-chair a similar dialogue called AGREE that's funded by the major foundations in this country that's trying to do the same kind of long-term thing. So I'd say that is there, and what they're saying is wonderful. I'd mention two challenges that we have, however. One challenge is the U.S. government has been a big benefactor over the last 60 years in agriculture, huge benefactor. Not all segments of agriculture have benefited the same way. Those days are changing. I'm not going to say they're over because I think the Congress is exploring this right now, how to deal with the deficit and fiscal issues and how to make payments to producers sensible in a way where we're really struggling with this debt problem. But no longer will Uncle Sam be providing the same kinds of monies into agriculture than it's done in years past. So we have to learn how to cope with that. Fortunately, we're in a period, I think, of higher farm prices for a long time to come. And that will mean that farmers may be less dependent on Uncle Sam than they have been before. And perhaps the programs can shift to ways that really help folks when they really need it. The second thing is research. Folks talked about technology and other things. It is disgraceful how we have let our national research budget fall in real terms in the last 10, 15 years in agriculture. And the only way we're going to address the problems that Jason and others have talked about, which is feeding a hungry world in a sustainable way with food safety in mind and do it safely and so consumers have confidence, and to grow more and increase yields and do that in a way both here at home and around the world, is to have an effective research budget. And I'm reminded that 50 years ago we did this in the Green Revolution, and it's basically stopped. I'm not saying there isn't research going on, but the levels of public research into agriculture are astonishingly low in real terms. And we have to turn that around if we want to really address some of these long-term challenges, which is a problem because it costs money to do that. But we're going to have to redirect some of these funds to more long-term purposes. And I think in that sense we can be a much stronger country and have a much stronger agriculture in America and around the world too.
I want to take a question from one of our folks through our website, but before that, Dan, I just wanted to give a postscript. I missed you in those powdered wigs.
Yeah, well, I don't have very much hair anyway, so I've learned to show my scalp more, like Bob Stallman does.
Exactly, exactly. So I want to go to a question that Michelle posted on our website. First, she said, you know, just as we've talked about, what is the U.S. Ag's responsibility in feeding a population expected to exceed $9 billion by 2050? So that's part one. What is the U.S.'s obligation? And then second, do you agree or disagree that it takes all types of farms to offer both the choices and necessary quantities of food? So Bob, let's start with you on that.
Well, absolutely, and that's a great question, Phil. It does, starting with the last question first, it does take all of us. It takes all different kinds of production. It takes all different kinds of commodities being produced. And that's the one thing we want to emphasize to consumers, I think, as farmers and ranchers. We want choices for consumers. We want healthy choices for consumers, and we want to help inform consumers about what those choices mean. But at the end of the day, to meet the needs that we're going to have to by 2050, we're all in this together. It doesn't matter whether you're local, organic, conventional, biotech, range-free, those kind of free-range items and livestock, and that's going to be part of it because consumers are going to demand choice, but at the same time, we need to be producing food every way we can to make up that amount that we're going to need by 2050.
And the first part of the question, what's our responsibility, the U.S.'s responsibility to feed people globally?
Well, speaking for farmers and ranchers, we've always felt that we had a moral responsibility even to do everything we could first to provide for food for this country, but that we did have a responsibility to continue to do what we could in terms of production to meet the needs of many other consumers across the world. And we've done a fantastic job of this. We're frankly have been the breadbasket of the world. There are other countries now that are stepping up and producing more. But consumers, I think, really are more interested in what's happening to their food production that we're providing for them, and maybe, according to the surveys, not quite so interested in the concept of feeding the world. But I think farmers and ranchers still feel that tug that we do have the capability and, to some extent, the responsibility to help provide that food for a growing and hungry world.
Dan?
I would say, you know, for years and years we had big surpluses, largely in the grains and oilseeds, rice. And so we had the luxury of using a lot of those surpluses to feed hungry people around the world. Those days are probably largely over, the days of big surpluses. And yet the U.S., I think, still has a responsibility to help in making the world more self-sufficient, to build indigenous production systems in sub-Saharan Africa and other places that need it desperately. Why? Because it's the right thing to do, as Bob said. We're also in a global economy. So what happens in Kenya or Tanzania or Indonesia affects us very directly, both from a political situation as well as getting ourselves involved in international conflicts. And in fact, we saw with the Arab Spring, the problems in North Africa were in part due to lack of subsidized food in some of those countries. And so it is in our interest to be engaged in these areas.
Jason, you agree?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about what the U.S. role is globally. I think that, in fact, what we've found with famine and refugee and crisis situation is when we bring in food from the U.S. or Europe, what we do is undermine local food markets. And so just when local farmers or regional farmers should be getting higher prices because there's a scarcity, they get undercut by the import of cheap food. So we need to be more thoughtful about that, because we need to be stimulating food production in those places to prevent future famines rather than undermining them. And I think we've learned a lot in the last 30 years about that. The other issue, though, that I think is important is back to your earlier question. Yes, we need to be scale neutral. I would say we ought to be technology neutral as well. Let's focus on results. What are the results we want to see? How much soil erosion per ton of output is acceptable? Today it uses a liter of water to produce a calorie of food on this planet. Is that acceptable? How do we get it down to a half a liter to produce 2 calories? Let's start getting the right metrics, the right science. I think part of what the science that we need to develop, and I think the U.S. could play a real lead in this, is how do we measure what is sustainable? How do we begin to understand what the range of production is and shift the entire performance curve? If we don't have metrics, we just have opinions. And opinions are good for everybody. But as that old expression we used to have in Missouri goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Where the hell are we going? What do we want to do?
John?
I think one of the encouraging trends I see in agriculture is that we are increasingly consumer focused. When I was a kid growing up on a farm in Cooksville, Illinois, my dad would take his corn and soybeans and oats to the local elevator, and that basically was his market. That's kind of where it ended. I don't think we're doing that today. I think we're much more in tune of, where are those products going? What does the consumer demand? And I think where that affects this question is when you think about, all the other kinds of agriculture that we can engage in this country and folks are engaged in, I'm seeing a much more consumer-driven, consumer-focused response from producers saying that, you know what, if organic is something that we can produce and there's a consumer demand for it, let's go for it. That's an opportunity for us. We can do that. We don't grow corn on our farm because we're in love with corn. We grow it because we've got resources, we've got some knowledge, but we also know we've got some tools that can help us participate in a lot of other ways that I think, while it won't all be focused on meeting a growing global demand, it certainly is going to be adding a measure to domestic security, I think, as far as being able to produce food that we need as this country. That's very encouraging and very positive.
Kathy, hearing what everybody's saying, what comes to mind is the discussions that I've heard, and this panel can certainly verify them true or not, that if in fact we wanted to do everything humanely and we want to do all these challenges, we don't have enough room on the planet. What do we do?
Well, I don't think that I would disagree with you that we don't have enough room for humane. I think there's always room for humane and animal welfare. However, I do think there are choices in animal welfare too, and some of the groups that have been persistent about driving the highest cost solution and mandating that it be one sort of production over another is to us not fair. There should be choices, like there are choices in what you want to eat, but we don't have a food agenda. People can eat whatever they want to. We just feel people have no right to abuse animals. So how do we provide them with choices to say, I want to participate, I want my animals to be well taken care of, but I want to be able to afford it. So for to see the most expensive solutions be mandated is wrong, because it becomes elitist. And when you put animal welfare into a category that only rich people can afford, it's wrong. So we want to broaden it and make choices available for animal welfare so that it is not a barrier to trade, but a criteria to trade, and that animals are considered to be a vital part of our food supply.
Jason, and then Bob, I want your opinion on this.
Well, I think in terms of, the animal welfare issues is a very interesting one. We have to be very careful about not maximizing one solution at the expense of optimizing several. And I think that goes way beyond animal welfare into other issues too. But animal welfare is not just about space. It's about mortality. It's about time to market. It's about feed conversion. These are all indicators of animal welfare. Basically how rapidly animals gain weight is an indicator of the stress on them, et cetera. So we need to be looking at these in a more complicated way to come up with indices that are more reflective of this rather than just single issues. But I think that's true of sustainability way more generally than just animal welfare.
Bob?
Well, it's interesting, the survey that we did comparing farmer and rancher values and consumer values is that we're both very committed and interested in the welfare of animals, humane animal production practices. So I think it's very clear from a producer standpoint that we're going to respond to that. And as we try to meet the challenge of producing ever more amounts of protein, in the case of animal and meat particularly, we will have to figure out ways to improve on what we do. And I think that's a message that often gets lost perhaps in these food debates we've been having and amongst consumers, is that agriculture has continually been about improvement. Farmers and ranchers are looking for ways to improve. And more research will provide us those kind of answers. And as we move forward and get more experience, more research, address consumer needs and also the restrictions we have relative to other resources on this planet, I'm confident farmers and ranchers are going to figure out a way to do it.
Trey, I want to go back to the retail. Large retailer, obviously the world's largest food retailer. How do you answer the question about big farms, small farms? How does Walmart look at big farms versus small farms based on the criteria that you laid out, what Walmart's agenda is?
Thanks, Phil. With 140 million customers every week, we have a real challenge trying to keep our shelf stocked with the products that customers want at the prices they want. And there's no one place for us to go and get all the products that we need at those right prices. In fact, in our supply chain, there's room for everybody, from very large conventional farms to very small niche farms. You may have a pumpkin grower in the Mid-Atlantic that drives 1 or 2 truckloads of pumpkins to our stores, or 1 or 2 truckloads of sweet corn in Georgia. But we also have to take this model even more global. We had a question earlier from online, what's the role for U.S. agriculture in the world? From our perspective and in our supply chain, we see opportunities to take U.S. agriculture with us as we grow overseas to new consumers. You have consumers in all parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, that are growing in wealth. So we have a supplier in California makes a mixed nut product for us. We've introduced that to consumers in Central America and Mexico, and we'll take it other places. We've just opened stores through franchise agreements and small cash and carry businesses in India. We're now working with farmers in Washington State to supply them with some apples and apple products. We opened stores in Chile. We're introducing things there like cranberry sauce, completely new and unique to customers there. So there's a lot of opportunity for U.S. agriculture to engage globally.
I just, listening to Trace, I'm thinking that if somebody were to ask me who is the most influential entity in the food and agriculture environment today, I'd probably turn to my friend right here, because they serve more customers than anybody in the world. And it's not just Walmart, it's people like Walmart. 20 years ago, you probably would have never had a major food chain in a discussion like this, because Walmart and the consumer will have as much to do what the food producer does as Congress will or as regulators will in the future. So I think it's very significant, and the fact that they've become very sensitive to a lot of these issues, reformulating their foods to reduce salt and fat in their foods. They're engaged in all parts of this discussion, and I think that's really an important change in American agriculture.
Just to build on that, if I could, Phil, and talk about Walmart, we think breakfast in the classroom, school breakfast is very important. A hungry child, it's difficult to learn. And we are seeing tremendous results when kids eat breakfast, whether it's in the classroom, in the cafeteria. Headaches, stomach aches, dramatically reduced. But it takes more than government support, and Walmart has stepped forward, the Walmart Foundation, and provided that support financially. And we've been able to spread breakfast in the classroom throughout the country due to the support of Walmart, which is very critical.
To be respectful, what do we say to those farmers, those ranchers, those consumers that say, we're giving Walmart too much power? Having heard everything that the three of you said, there's also that whole other side that says, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, that watermelon vendor is going to sell all their stuff to Walmart. As a result, Walmart's now in power and said, here's what you're going to charge me. You're not going to necessarily make the profit. How do you respond to that?
Thanks, Phil, for that. You know, when we talk, but when we talk about sustainability and sustainability around agriculture, we don't consider it to be just about the environment. There are other things that interplay there, whether it's ethics or some of these social issues. And the livelihood of farmers is one of those, has to be one of those metrics. If we don't have a healthy but vibrant American agriculture economy, we don't have the products on our shelves that we have to sell to our customers. So it's incumbent on us to work with our suppliers, to work with others in the supply chain in the industry to make sure that we have this economy and that we're paying appropriate prices for our products. Of course we want to get those prices down to the most competitive level and pass those savings on to our customers. That's who we are. That's what we're about. Our tagline says, save money, live better. But farmers and ranchers around the country are also our suppliers. And so we have to have them healthy. There's one thing that Jason talked about earlier, and that's around having good metrics and good indices to guide us on the decisions that we're making. And I think that's critical. We're at a point. We have some grand challenges at this point in time, but we have to have good science, good metrics, and use those to make sure they're guiding our decisions appropriately so that we're doing the right thing for consumers, we're doing the right thing for the environment, we're doing the right thing for the economy.
I want to move on to the next question, but Dan, I know you have a comment.
First of all, I love Walmart. They've done a great thing, and they're socially responsible, but the real trick here is to make sure there's competition. So we don't want them owning all the grocery stores in America either. And so you got to have a competitive system where you have active enforcement of our antitrust laws, anti-concentration laws, to ensure that there is, in fact, full competition for farmers to compete as well as for consumers to choose to buy.
I'd like to ask this to all of our panelists. And I think I know Jason's answer, but I'm going to start with you anyway. What's the one thing that we need to focus on over the next 10 years? Just that one thing to improve the process from start to finish, if you would, farm to fork, to delivering high-quality, safe food to everyone in America.
You really want to constrain it that way?
Yes, I do.
Globally.
No, America.
I'm saying globally, the one issue that if I were going to look at just one thing, it would be soil carbon. If we don't have good soil, we don't have farms. And it's as simple as that. And most farms globally are actually losing more soil than they're producing. And so building soil, bringing carbon into pricing, paying farmers for increasing soil carbon, for increasing carbon, creating new assets from carbon, solving climate change issues and increasing food production at the same time. If we could begin to think about that and develop metrics around that and push that forward in 10 years, that would be a great game.
Kathy?
I think in the holistic approach to looking at how we look at our food, that it isn't just something on the table, but there was someone on an animal on one end from the protein standpoint, a farmer or a rancher growing that. Somebody has prospered through the time of selling it, buying it, and all that we revolve around in that. And so obviously I'm going to go back to saying animals are the most important, but it is when we have a respect for food, I think that we begin to see it from who grows it, who the animal is, the entire sustainability issue of the way we look at our food.
Bob, most important point?
I'm going to have to go with research. Secretary Glittman talked about it earlier. When you look at the tremendous advances that have occurred in agriculture that allowed us to be more productive, and frankly, that's translated directly into consumers' pockets in terms of lower prices, our rate of productivity gain is starting to decline. And a reason for that in agriculture is this reduction in public research for agriculture. And so for the long term, to get the technologies in place and the things we're going to have to do to produce more from basically the same amount of land and probably having fewer resources to do it with, we're only going to reach that challenge by investing in research and developing those technologies that we're going to need to use.
John?
All good points have been made. I guess I would add the point that I think one of the things we're going to have to be very mindful of is how we react to some of the challenges that we have to the agricultural industry. We tend to be on the defensive a lot, and I think that's sending a message to an awful lot of people, and it's been borne out in some of the statistics and the survey work that's been done, that they're not real sure that we're aware of some of the challenges. Do we care? Are we taking steps to address it? All of which I think there's an affirmative answer to. But I think particularly when you look at a changing political environment, policy issues playing a critical role in terms of what the future of this industry looks like and what our ability to meet that growing demand is going to be, that being very upfront and saying we've got challenges, there are places we may need help to meet those challenges, but we also have a terrific opportunity to be part of a solution to make sure that we have a workable and a productive system, I think is another factor that's going to be very important that we address.
Frank, the #1 issue for the next 10 years when it comes to our food supply?
I would definitely agree with research, but I would add education, particularly nutrition. And farmers listen. We have a farm-to-school initiative, and when farmers visit schools and help educate children about what they do, we see an increase in consumption of fruits and vegetables. But I think education, particularly for children on nutrition, is my #1 priority.
Trace?
So all good points have been made and would certainly agree with the prior panelist. I will take the perspective of our core customer. And our immediate need, not just for food but for everything, is fixing the economy. Bring unemployment down, spur innovation, get people into jobs, and improve consumer confidence because it's pretty challenged right now. And so in terms of food, people would like to invest in food, they'd like to buy more, but we see in some cases in our stores where people run out before the end of the month and have 10 days where they can't even shop. So we'd love to sell food, but they don't have the money to do it. So if we can fix the economy, get employment numbers back down, get some security back in jobs and get consumer confidence back up, then I think we have a license to work on many of these other issues that we want to focus on.
And hopefully that doesn't take 10 years.
Hopefully not.
I agree with what everybody said, so if I have to be a little bit different, unique, I just say water. We use about 75% of the world's water for agriculture and the irrigation of crops. We have the largest underground lake in the world that feeds corn production all throughout the Great Plains that's being depleted rapidly. And water depletion is taking place all over sub-Saharan Africa. I heard today that it's in China. The amount of water that's used in agriculture that's being minimized by drought and urbanization. And the growth of people moving from rural into urban parts of this world is dramatic. And I guarantee you they will not have water for agriculture as their highest priority. They will have water for their own usage as the highest priority. So we have to find a way to grow more crops, to feed more people, to feed more animals with better or less use of water. And I think that's a dominant issue facing the future.
So as we started the discussion, we talked about dirtier air, less water, less land as the foundation for some of the issues. How do we talk to consumers today about the rising food prices? We've seen huge increases so far this year. Everything that I read looks like it's going to continue to increase. How do we address the consumer concern that says, back to Trey's customer, I can't afford to eat, I can't afford the food? It's about communication. That's what this dialogue is all about. What's the message that collectively we need to get to the consumer to really respond to that particular question? Food prices going up, going to continue to go up. Who wants to take a shot at this one? Bob.
Yeah, let me start, Phil. And, this gets into systemic problems, within the global economy, and that is related to energy. The biggest driver of higher food prices is energy cost, the price of oil. And that affects everything throughout the chain. Agriculture, farmers and ranchers, about 20% of our input costs are related to energy. So obviously when the price of energy goes up, that directly affects production costs at the farm level. But not only that, throughout the food chain, energy costs have a huge impact. And there's a lot of blame that gets thrown around for higher food prices. But if you really want to do the analysis, it's pretty much correlated to the price of oil.
We have time for one more panelist to comment about food prices. Then we've got a ton of questions from our audience, and I want to go to those. Jason?
Food prices, I mean, most of the people who are looking at this think that food prices are going to continue to rise, and it certainly was linked to energy in the past, but now it's becoming linked more broadly to resource scarcity, water, land, etc. And in fact, we don't pay for any environmental externalities. So we don't pay for pollution, we don't pay for soil loss, we don't pay for biodiversity loss, we don't pay for water, actually, in most places. We start putting prices on any of those things, and the price of food goes up. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. We've got to figure out how we can produce more with less and get the quality we need at a price the planet can live with.
And with that, let's head to our audience here in Washington. Who has the first question for us? If you could stand up and identify yourself and where you're from, and don't stand up.
Thank you. My name is Audrey Adamson, and my question is addressed to Dr. Clay. You talked about doubling food production. You also mentioned the need to concentrate production, more production, less land, less water, to feed a population with more income looking to put more protein in their diets. How do you envision U.S. agriculture, and for that matter, global agriculture, meeting that challenge?
Well, I would hope that the U.S. agriculture would begin to look more at what are the metrics we need. What crops produce more calories per acre? What crops produce more nutrients per acre? What crops produce more nutrients per liter of water, per kilo of soil erosion? I mean, we need to start looking at this a little more carefully. We have the science and we have the systems and the infrastructure in place to do this. We could lead the world in this discussion. And we have the most fertile land base to proceed from to help shape these discussions. We're not going to feed the world by ourselves, though. And in fact, we would never want to take that challenge on. We're all in this together. We've all got to figure out solutions, but we need to play much more of a leadership role than we have. And I think our innovation has been kind of stymied in the last 40 or 50 years. I think we need to get back on track on that and show what we can do. But there's not going to be a single silver bullet. We're going to have to look at genetics. We're going to have to look at technology. We're going to have to look at better practice. We're going to have to figure out how to bring degraded land back into production. You know, lots of different things. We will, through these piecemeal, we will get to what we need, the doubling of food.
Next question from our audience. And if you could stand up and identify yourself and where you're from.
My name is Jennifer Garrett. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. And I wanted to
I didn't mean the city, the company, your organization. But welcome, Chicago.
Thank you. I'm a nutritionist and I work at McCain Foods. And I wanted to thank the panel for acknowledging the importance of science, of research, and Frank, of nutrition, because that is a very critical piece, obviously. 65% of the children are not overweight or obese, yet our food programs continue to be designed in schools for those that are. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is the vegetable that kids prefer most, which would be the most affordable vegetable, potatoes and corn, are being limited to 1 serving per week. This is not a science-based decision. It's not a research-based decision. So how can we help continue to get USDA to make science and research-based decisions so that kids can have potatoes and corn in schools?
I would just say that that might be a bit premature because the decision has not been made. The USDA is still taking that under consideration, and we have had numerous meetings with the USDA, and we'll see in December what the final regs are, but I said that might be a bit premature at this point to make that comment.
Since I was also involved in this whole issue of the food guide pyramid, now it's the plate and other issues, this is always a complicated subject because everybody has their parochial interest in what should be served either in the schools or what should be preferred in the designation of the pyramid and everything else. I give great compliments on this issue to both Congress and the administration because they have passed legislation, hopefully gets implemented properly, that in fact will result in much greater authority to improve the nutritional quality of food in the school feeding programs. But, you know, we have to, on this one, we do have to go with the science. And the science is becoming more and more clear, although not perfectly clear, that a diet needs to be much more balanced than the kind of diet I got when I was going to school a very long time ago, and most of the people in this audiences were. And I think USDA is leading in that direction with the help of Frank and organizations like his.
Claire, I think we've got some tweets, some Facebooks, and some questions from out there in the universe.
We do, yeah. The social media is exploding with questions. And I think this one is probably best for Secretary Glickman. And a really interesting subject, it hasn't come up yet. It seems like agriculture is a vital component to our national security. Yes. Do you see American agriculture included in national security policies pertaining to food safety, foreign labor, the economy, and our military? And you would know this, is it already generally part of those discussions?
I think it's getting more and more highlighted. You know, I felt for a long time that food and agriculture issues and related conservation issues were really relegated down too low in terms of our national discussion. But I know that issues like global food security now have gotten great interest from the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, as well as the Secretary of Agriculture. And I think people are recognizing that in this global world, we're inextricably linked together. And what happens in one part of the world really impacts us. And, you know, I want to go back to this question about food prices. We've been fortunate in America. The amount of our dollar we pay for food is far less than most places in the world. We've actually benefited from the fact that our food is relatively cheap in America. In other parts of the world, it isn't so cheap. In fact, it's so cheap here that we throw away in the garbage around 90 billion pounds of food every year, wasted, unused, and that kind of thing. So, you know, my hope is that food security issues will rise, both domestic production as well as globally, and I think it's happening right now.
And one that I think is appropriate for Jason on Twitter from @MountainFarmer. Why is it that we use technology, medicine, science, and best practices in almost everything we do, but it's taboo or controversial in farming?
Well, I mean, you know, it's interesting. I think I grew up on a farm, a very small farm, and I learned how to farm from my father and my grandfather, and I think that's how actually most farmers learn. So I think farming itself has traditionally, and much more so globally than even in the US now, is linked to generations past and wisdom past that hasn't been challenged, that hasn't been, a lot of farmers don't adopt the best practices or are 20, 50, 60 years late in coming to the table. You look at productivity, the best farmers in the world are 100 times better than the worst. We need to close that gap. With IT, with information technology, we can do that much faster. It doesn't mean that there's a single practice we should be pushing, but what are the results that we want to measure farmers on, and how do they get to improve themselves? That's the kind of questions, that's how we need to think about this issue. Hopefully, you know, at World Wildlife Fund, we see farming as the biggest threat to the planet, but also the biggest opportunity to get right. But no mistake about it, if we don't get where we produce food and how we produce food right, we can turn out the lights and go home. From the point of view of biodiversity, we've lost the battle.
And Phil, one more from our Facebook chat from Christopher. Bob, I'll direct this to you. If companies that raise livestock feel consumers have an inaccurate perception of modern agriculture, why don't they allow more transparency into the process? Can there be more transparency, or is that another misperception?
That is a great question, and I think there is a growing recognition amongst producers that we need to have greater transparency. You know, farmers and ranchers tend to be fairly private people. They don't want a lot of strangers messing around on their farm or ranch. And then plus you add in the factor of some who are actively out to get farmers and ranchers. It creates a little paranoia, but I think there's a realization now that consumers want some of that transparency. And if you'll go on YouTube, you will see, and in many cases, they're younger farmers opening up their operations on YouTube with very direct and clear video of what they're doing inside. There are other operations like Fair Oaks that are encouraging consumers to come in, citizens to come in and look at their operations. And I think that's a growing trend. There are still some biosecurity issues involved, because sometimes, particularly in livestock production, you want to be sure that there's not going to be any transmission of any bacteria or disease. But those are addressed generally with the way you prep the people coming in. So I think you will see more of it as we go through these dialogues.
Interesting. Well, I mean, the other thing I would wonder is, you talked about YouTube and that sort of transparency, but what does that even mean, transparency? Does that mean, having tours once a week, or, literally, how do you achieve that beyond YouTube access? What do you think people really want when they say transparency?
I am hoping that through this conversation that we're going to have with consumers, that farmers and ranchers are going to have with consumers, we're going to get an idea of what consumers want to see as transparency. Mm-hmm. We don't really understand, I think, at this point, how much consumers want to know. I'll be honest with you, I'm a beef producer. There may be a reluctance for consumers to really get down in the, let's just say, cow poop to the extent that we have to when we are working cattle. They may not want to see all of that. I don't know, but we're going to find out. And I think there's a growing willingness on the part of producers now to figure out a way to open up their operations and make it more transparent to consumers.
There is one more, Phil, that I think is interesting, but you will have to help me direct it. It is from Yi Wang on our fooddialogues.com site. Farmers and ranchers in many countries have rejected the ecological risks and some of the worries posed by genetically modified crops and food. How does this affect, or I suppose pressure, U.S. farmers' decisions on what kind of seeds they plant?
Well, I think, Jason, you could probably give us the overall, and then Dan, I'd like you to answer that as well. But also before we do that, one thing, Bob, to your point, when we look at transparency, we've done two things. One is we had a public television special called Food Sense that we called farmers and ranchers around the country to bring our cameras in and to tell the story. And I can't tell you how difficult it was in order to do that and to not think that we were going to, and again, it's public television. We're not sensational. On the other hand, we now give farmers and ranchers flip cameras to do their own tours that we post on our website. And I can tell you, we have a line of people who want to expose what they're doing. But back to Claire's point, Jason.
Well, I think if you look at food production, you can't take genetics off the table. I mean, genetics is what got us here. As they used to say, dance with the one that brung you. I mean, we wouldn't be in a city without genetics. We'd still be hunting and gathering, and population would be much, much lower than it is today. So the question isn't if, it's how. We've got to do plant breeding. Can we use modern technology to select for markers and traits and actually do breeding that enhances drought tolerance, disease resistance, productivity? You can do all of those things with genetic and engineering and still not have a GMO. So who's really against that? And in fact, if you want to look at something like corn, I mean, corn is arguably the first GMO in existence because it was created from two unrelated, directly related species thousands of years ago. I mean, so this was done by indigenous groups in Mexico a long, long time ago. So I think we just need to really get our heads around what is it that we're afraid of, and then begin to whittle away at the metrics around this and see what we can buy into. And there's going to be differences. Different markets are going to require different things. Fine, that's fine. But let's start talking about science and data and not about assumption and fears. And let's get science and data around the assumptions and fears.
I agree with Jason. I make a couple of points. There's been a lot of exploitive political rhetoric out there about the issue of GMOs, and on both sides of the issue. And some of the companies early on said it was the cure for every disease known to human being, including the lack of hair on our heads. And I haven't seen a GMO crop that's addressed that yet. Once they do, they'll make a lot of money. But the truth is that on the other side, there are people who they have the fear of it. And in a lot of cultures, the manipulation of genes is not viewed as a positive for historic reasons and other kinds of things. And I think what you need here is we need all these technologies, including genetic engineering as appropriate, but you also need an effective regulatory system. So it looks like the public interest is being served by people watching out for the public as a whole who don't have a financial interest in pushing a particular genetic engineered crop into the marketplace. And with that, I think we're a lot better off today than we were 15 or 20 years ago. And, but I do think there are some cultures, some places, especially in Europe, where there is just this almost pathological resistance to the issue of genetic engineering. The problem with that is that you probably can't feed the world with less water and less soil and dealing with pests and drought and disease without at least using some of this technology. And the more we can talk about these issues openly, the better we will be.
All right, and interestingly, Phil, we now have a question from one of our California panelists for this panel. Jane, I think you have a panelist question for us.
Yes, we do, Claire. Thank you very much. The challenge is daunting. You're kind of bumming me out back there. How are we going to feed the world? But somehow I think, as someone said, we're going to figure it out. One of our panelists, Michael Dimmock, is here, and he is the president of Roots of Change, and I know a pioneer in the slow food movement. Michael, what's your question?
Well, I actually want to reach back to the Midwest a little bit, where we got into the discussion around antibiotics. And in the spirit of transparency, I think it's really important to go to another level. We talked about the therapeutic use of antibiotics, and we all agree that animals that are sick need to have antibiotics, and we really appreciate the work of farmers to keep those antibiotics and animals out of the food stream. The big concern for people in my world is the subtherapeutic use of antibiotics, and that wasn't really discussed. I think it's important that we hear about the impact of subtherapeutic antibiotics and the concerns of Harvard University and others, that those are impacting the efficacy of antibiotics in the long term.
Seems like a natural for you.
Well, let me just go personal with this one. Actually, I use subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics in a weaning ration for the breeding heifers that ultimately turn into our breeding stock on the farm. And we do it for about 30 days. And the reason we do it is very simple, is because it keeps the animals healthier than they would be otherwise, because weaning, whether it's a human baby or a calf, is a stressful period of time for an animal. And so making that transition and having that subtherapeutic use for that brief period of time does bring health benefits. Otherwise, you would have sick animals that you would have to be treating with acute for therapeutic doses for acute conditions. And so that's why we do it. Other than that, I don't use them on the farm, but there are reasons for doing this, and I think that's part of this dialogue, is to explain the reasons that they're used. Farmers and ranchers are always looking for ways to improve. In a perfect world, we would like to farm and ranch without any inputs, because inputs cost us money. The reality is that's not going to work very well. So we want to minimize the use of things that do add to our input costs. But at the same time, we have a responsibility, I think, to keep, in the case of animals, the animals as healthy as possible.
Interesting.
And let's stay at UC Davis. Jane, I understand an audience member has a question for our panel as well.
That's right, Phil. We have a Dr. Rob Terry, if you want to stand up and address your question to the panel in D.C.
Yes. I think we've learned over time, recent times, how our lack of energy independence has impacted our national security. And I'm just wondering, is there any concern that current political, economic, social trends could be leading us down a similar path with our agricultural and food security?
Go to Secretary Glickman first.
I hope not. It's ironic in the area of energy security. In many respects, we're not much better off today than we were 40 years ago. You think about it. The same issues, the same kind of imports. We're looking at some alternatives. There's a lot of people who criticize biofuels, including ethanol, don't realize that it's still about the only realistic alternative there is to put in your car today if we were to be embargoed with gasoline is ethanol. So we haven't made a lot of progress there. We're probably more vulnerable today than we've ever been. And agriculture is probably the most vulnerable industry to being cut off. I hope that this kind of debate and all of the issues that we're now seeing elevated to the national level makes us realize that food security is even more important than energy security for the long-term future of the globe. And we certainly are seeing that in the developing world. And to think that we in America are immune from this is probably not realistic. That is, we have the same long-term vulnerabilities on water and soil and pest and disease that almost everybody else does in the world. We had a drought in Texas, as Bob knows, this year that was like, it was, I don't know if it was a 100-year, a 1,000-year, or a 10,000-year drought. And I suspect those conditions are getting more and more frequent. And whatever the cause of them is, we have to be prepared to deal with them in order to produce enough food in this world.
And let's go to Fair Oaks. And Max, you haven't had me on your radio show recently. What's going on here? But I know you have a question from someone in your audience as well.
Now that you mention it, pal, it'll be just a matter of days, Phil. Yeah, our group here has been nodding their head in agreement, shaking their head a little bit, but listening attentively by all means. We do have a question from the audience. Would you please stand and identify yourself and direct the question?
Hi, I'm Dr. Carolyn Orr, family beef producer. I wondered why consumers are willing to pay 10 times more for new cars and refrigerators with the best technology and the most updated technology. But when it comes to food, they won't pay any more and they don't want technology. I'm getting, until this year, we got the same for cattle this year that we got 25 years ago on the hoof. And yet they complain about food prices.
Well, I'm not sure who here wants to take a stab at that, but because that's a tough one, but I can tell you that I agree with you. All the consumer panel surveys that we do on a constant basis finds the exact same thing. And I think it goes back to something that the panel said before, which is about education. I don't think that we've done a great job really educating consumers to really what goes on in our food supply, where our food comes from. And I know, Frank, you were part of the whole Food Sense project. Would you concur with that?
I would agree. Absolutely, Phil.
And Trey, what about you?
So I would say, you know, consumers aren't opposed to technology in food. I think, and you have to look at the processing side of the grocery store to identify some areas where consumers are willing to pay more. The example that comes to mind is probiotics in yogurt or added fiber in, you know, a cereal. Those sorts of things are important to consumers, and they'll pay more for it. Not all consumers. We obviously have a lot in our stores that don't have the opportunity to make those choices because it's too expensive and they're so dependent on price and meeting their monthly budgets. But I think there's an opportunity for technology in food. I think in animal agriculture it's a different conversation, and I don't have, you know, the answers in that regard. But
you know, I mean, food, energy, and housing are necessities of life. So people will always be much more personally attached to the cost of those things than they will be for luxuries or things that you don't have to survive. I do think that the subject of education is important. It's always kind of interested me that by and large Americans have gotten this enormous good deal on the price of food over the last 50 years. And you go talk, I remember when I was a politician, you go talk to people, you say, you don't know what a good deal you're getting. And that wasn't very good languaging to most Americans. But I think people have gotten used to that. And the marketplace works pretty well when it comes to food prices. And so they're not as elastic as they are in some other areas. But I do think we have to do a much better job of explaining what it is and how it is that we produce food and how it impacts the consumers from a price perspective.
And let's head up to New York. John, I understand there's someone in your audience who actually has a question for one of the panel members on Max's panel at Fair Oaks.
That's right, Phil. We're going back to Fair Oaks. Need to really address a couple of questions here that Philip Corrigan has. So, Philip, if you would mind.
Thank you. Philip Corrigan is my name. I'm New York-based agricultural veterinary consultant working mainly in the development or aid programs internationally. Just regarding the farmer representatives from Indiana, and they said the panel was represented by really large farm representatives, and 4,000 acres was cited as examples of family farms. But historically, the family farm was 200 acres or less, or 300 acres, very, very small. What is the future for viable farms, whether they're family farms or just economic farms? Is it that they get bigger or get out, or is there a future for the smaller based farm?
That's a great question. We'll direct it to our panel here. Is there a place for all of these farms? Can you carve a niche if you've got 100 acres, 200 acres, 300 acres? Malcolm?
You know, I actually am the son of a small farmer, and I kind of take my verification of where we have grown our farm from my father. When my father looks at what we have done and how now my next generation will be able to come into our business, he looks at that and he gives me admiration. And I take that so strongly because, you know, size, I want to say size doesn't matter, but, you know, it's one of those things that if you're doing a good job, it doesn't matter how big your farm is. The thing that we need to understand, though, is that farming is hard work. And if you need help, then you have to pay for that help. And the next thing that happens is you start to grow more crops, or you start to grow more pigs or more dairy cows, and it starts to feed itself. And so I really don't get comfortable at all with the distinction between large and small, because there is a natural evolution in our business.
Gary, let me come over to you as the CEO of Fair Oaks Farms here. Would you like to address that yourself?
Yeah, I think the terrific thing about American agriculture, and I'll speak to that because that's what we're a part of, is that I still believe there's a role for everybody. And there's niche markets out there that don't necessarily require growth to serve. That if you're doing a great job, as Malcolm described, you can make a very comfortable living, enjoy doing what you're doing. We have a great diversity of market in the United States to which to serve, and we have a great diversity of methods to serve that. Large farms, small farms, this, that, whatever. And so I think there's a role for everybody, and there will continue to be a role for everybody. We may go more or start going more 80-20-ish as we go through time, but I don't think that's a bad thing. Most of U.S. industry is like that, or U.S. businesses are like that. But that 20%, there is absolutely a role for them in my perspective.
Yeah, you bet. All right, Claire, back to you there. I understand you have more of the program you'll take away at this point.
Thanks, Max. Well, if Phil will indulge me, my journalistic hat is on, and I had a question for our panel. Just listening to all of you talk about the many different priorities, you know, from the environment to treating animals humanely, feeding the world. Suddenly, you know, Americans and people around the world want to eat in a healthier way, a more organic way. It seems to me that, in fact, we may not be able to do all of this. I mean, that at a certain point, we have to be realistic about how organic can our food be if we want to save the world? How, you know, humanely can we do something if we're trying to, I mean, and I guess I'll throw it to John and let anybody else jump in, but can we accomplish all of this, or do we really need to sit down and be a little bit more realistic?
The task is daunting, there's no doubt about it. A lot of different pressures, a lot of different demands. But I think that we do have a terrific capacity to be able to focus on the idea of continuous improvement in agriculture, always strive to do better, make sure we continue priorities on research and some of the things we've talked about in this panel, to give producers what they need to be able to make smart decisions as new challenges and new opportunities come up. I think we've seen that in the past, and I think that's going to be what we're going to continue to see into the future. And you know, I think that we do have a lot of issues that we're going to have to address, and we've shown that we do have a capacity to be able to mold, to adapt, and I expect that's going to continue to be a big part of what we see into the future in this industry.
Claire, years ago, some folks in this audience are probably old enough to remember the movie The Graduate. And in that movie, Dustin Hoffman is there, and a man comes up to him and asks him what he's going to do in his life, and Dustin says, I don't know, and he says one word: plastics. Some of you may remember that. Well, if I had to utter one word today about economic future, I would put agriculture in that world. You know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, people thought agriculture was probably a dying business, all sorts of consolidation taking place, fewer and fewer younger people going into this business. That is changing. It's changing for a lot of reasons. The economics are better, the diversity of the business is better, the consumer choices are much more varied than ever were before. So while I don't think we're going to reach nirvana on earth and solve every problem that you talked about, I do think that the opportunities in food and agriculture production in the United States and the world have never been better. This is a growth, exciting industry. This is almost like the software world of the 1950s and 60s, the way I look at it.
Dan, thanks so much. So the key word is agriculture. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for being here today. Great questions, great comments, and Claire, back to you.
All right, Phil. Thanks for a terrific dialogue. I really have never, in all my years as a journalist, seen this sort of mixed up question format and the depth and the real answers that we're getting. It's terrific. Just ahead here at the Food Dialogues, we're going to have a special one-on-one interview with the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. But now, let's take another inside look at a real-life story from farmers and ranchers.
Cattle are very social animals. And it's really a science to really be able to make sure that that social order is not disturbed. My name is Rick Stott. I'm an Executive Vice President for AgriBeef. The feed that we put in front of the animals is a very nutritious and scientifically designed feed.
It's pretty amazing with the amount of effort that it takes to just put it together. I mean, we use nutritionists, PhD nutritionists that come in and help monitor the quality of the feed.
And it's got the right amount of protein, energy levels, and all the essential grasses and forages and grains that we would normally want them to have to be healthy and to use the resources to the best of their ability.
It's really a scientific and an important part of this operation to be able to feed these cattle appropriately. Well, there's three main operations that go on in any feedlot. The first is really related to cattle health and management. We have cowboys that ride on horses and go through the pen and look at each individual animal to assess their health. The second thing is really the feeding process. We feed these cattle 2 to 3 times a day. We keep track of how much feed is put in front of them and how much they've eaten. The third thing that goes on is part of the actual receiving of the feed itself. We buy commodities from local ranchers, no more than 50 miles radius from this feedlot. And so that really provides the farmers with a very functional and profitable alternative to sell their crops. One of the great things about this industry is that what we do here is almost 100% recyclable. Whether it's at the ranches or at the feedlots where we take the manure and compost it and bring it to the farmers, then they bring their corn into our feed. Every pen is unique. Every pen is diagnosed and determined how much feed based upon the type of cattle that they're in, the frame that they have, the capacity that they have to be able to consume the right amount of grains and feed. All of that is determined by our feedlot people and people that have been around cattle all their lives.
We can look at this other pen over here. So if we go over here and we look at this other pen,
there you go.
This was an issue where we had some cattle that didn't have the best health in the world when they came into the feedlot. And so it showed how your cowboys, your crew, really straightened those cattle out, got them healthy again, and we can see that.
You know, the cattle industry and environmental practices have gone beyond. I mean, it started from the very beginning. It just only makes sense that you better take care of the land, because next year you're going to bring those cattle back on that same land. And if you haven't treated it properly, that grass isn't going to be there. And we have to use these resources more efficiently every single day. We've initiated a composting program. We're taking manure from the cattle, and we're basically selling it back to the farmers, local farmers who produce corn. So it's 100% recyclable. That's the really neat thing about this thing, is that we provide a natural nutrient to these farmers and provide them with a way to nourish their land, their crops, that the very crops that we feed back into the cattle that produces more manure and more compost and goes back into the land. And it's a complete, fully cycle type of environmental opportunity for us. I can tell you that nothing leaves this operation without it being controlled. There's no water that escapes, there's no water that leaves. It's a zero discharge facility. Underneath the pens themselves is a impenetrable layer of clay. What that means is that nothing seeps below that, nothing. Where you dig 6 inches below a wet surface in a pen, and it's completely and absolutely dry. The cattle industry has evolved dramatically in the last 40 years. I think like any other business in the world, technology has played a big role in that. The amount of information that we gather is really unbelievable. Every day's feed, every treatment that they have, every review that they go through, every animal that needs to be treated is identified uniquely and individually, and we know exactly what's been treated and how much and when. What we do as an industry is really exciting because what we do is provide great beef to the consumers around the world. As the population of the world grows, our responsibility is to really find new ways to do our job better, and we do that on a daily basis. I was at a food bank line a few months ago, right before Thanksgiving, and handing out our product. And of course, there was potatoes and great breads and vegetables and all kinds of great things for them to eat. And then they got to the end of the line, and we handed them a roast. That was something. That was a privilege to be able to do that. When you have people who look at you and say, now I know what I'm going to have for my Thanksgiving dinner. It's that's what this is about. It's about feeding people.
Oh, it's hard not to feel the emotion coming through in that story. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack, welcome to the Food Dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. Thank you for your time.
Great to be here.
It's been an incredible discussion so far. And one of the most interesting things is this study that they've done, really a poll from talking to farmers and ranchers and consumers. And it became very quickly clear that both sides feel misunderstood. And consumers certainly don't feel like they have enough information. So I guess I'd want to ask you first, what do you think the agriculture business, and I know that's a broad term because it varies widely, but can do to better answer the concerns that consumers have about nutrition and safety?
I think first and foremost, they've got to recognize that there's a need to deal with the perception that's out there by consumers. There's an education effort that must be undertaken, and it's got to be undertaken not in the context of discussing it in terms of 1950s or 1960s dialogue, which is that American farmers and ranchers are doing an extraordinary thing by helping to feed this country. I think there now has to be a concerted effort to educate folks about not only are we feeding this country, but we're doing it in an affordable way and in a nutritious way, and to really respond to the concerns that people have expressed. You know, we have a program in which we're trying to connect people to their farmer. We want folks to know who their farmer is. We want them to know about their farmer, in a sense, that these are really hardworking people. They care deeply about the land and about the water and about natural resources. They take extraordinary steps on their operations to protect the land and water. Sometimes that's forgotten or not fully understood. And that they are very anxious to make sure that what is provided is high quality and nutritious and safe.
You know, it's interesting. Well, 93% of farmers and ranchers think consumers do not understand them and what they do. And I was going to ask you, you know, what do you think they most don't understand? But you just gave a couple of great examples.
I think there are two things that we don't fully appreciate. First of all, this notion of food security, we couch it in terms of our farmers being able to produce enough food to feed us. I don't think we put it in the context of security. There are very few countries in the world today whose farmers are capable of producing enough to feed the people. So that means that those countries are dependent on some other country to provide them food. We are not necessarily dependent on anyone for food. That is a very important consideration that is almost always underappreciated. And secondly, while folks don't want to necessarily hear how affordable our food is because food prices go up and down, the reality is that Americans have far more flexibility in their paycheck because we spend less of a percentage of our paycheck for food than most anybody else in the world. Those two issues, food security and the capacity to spend a little more money on a car or a vacation or a college education for your children, is in part a response and a reaction to what farmers and ranchers do every single day.
Well, and I thought it was interesting today because the point came out that farmers and ranchers really do feel, and I don't think Americans understand this, a moral obligation, not just to feed Americans, but often to help feed the world. I don't think people understand that.
Well, not only do they not understand that, but they also don't understand the economic consequence of that. In the 1930s and 40s, we were just barely making it in terms of agriculture. Extraordinary productivity, embracing technology, figuring out ways to be more efficient, now allows us to meet our own needs here at home and to export in a way where we actually have a trade surplus. A lot of folks are concerned about the deficit, the fact that we spend more money in other countries than we get from other countries. Not so in agriculture. This year we'll have a record surplus, $42 billion more in sales than in purchases. And that means not just better incomes for farmers and ranchers, but as importantly, it means for every $1 billion, 8,400 jobs. At a time when we are deeply concerned about the number of jobs in this country, farmers and ranchers are creating an opportunity for greater employment in America. That's also something that's not fully appreciated.
Well, you mentioned the economy, the deficit. That's what everybody is thinking about these days. I mean, and you also talked about the jobs that agriculture has created. Beyond jobs, where do you think agriculture is most helping the economy? People might not recognize. And where do you think it could do better?
Well, 1 out of every 12 jobs in America is connected to what happens on farms and ranches. A lot of people don't think about the fact that when farmers and ranchers are doing well, as they are today, it makes it a little bit easier for them to buy a farm implement, which means that that implement has to be manufactured somewhere. So there's a factory line worker whose job is somewhat dependent on the agricultural economy. Secondly, I mentioned earlier that we have greater flexibility with our paychecks. While we're very concerned about the folks who are not working, the reality is those who are able to have a bit more flexibility. They are able to spend more in a consumer-oriented economy because they spend less on food. So that means they can buy a nicer car, they can buy a nicer home, they can buy a nicer appliance, they can take a vacation. All of that helps to create economic activity. And in reality, the American farmer in my view, has basically created the pathway to prosperity for this country. I mean, the reality is we're going to be a government that spends less but invests wisely. Farmers understood that. They went through a very difficult time in the 80s with debt. They've reduced their debt significantly. Farm assets are not encumbered very much, about roughly 10.8%. Debt to asset ratio, which means that 90% of our assets are not encumbered. That means that they are able to use more of their resources to advance technology and greater productivity, which has allowed them to export or create surpluses that are exported. If we became a nation following the agricultural model that spent less but invested wisely, we became an economy that makes, creates, and innovates as farmers have done, and then we basically create things that the rest of the world wants, which farmers have done, we will be able to export more, and as we export more, we create wealth. And that's what we're essentially seeing in many rural communities across the country. We just need to amplify that, multiply it, and expand it.
So should consumers feel maybe not as bad if they're paying a little bit more for food? I mean, prices are high, and it's hard for, and the fact is that helps farmers, which helps the farms, which helps the economy, but consumers still rebel against that. But as you mentioned, prices, generally speaking, aren't that high in this country.
Well, there are ways, obviously, to stretch your food dollar. Today, Americans are spending more and more of their food dollar outside the home. And so there is one way, obviously, that we need to be careful about how we spend our resources. But I think, if you're a conscious shopper, there are ways in which you can stretch that dollar, and a lot of struggling families are doing that right now. And we want to obviously assist them and help them in doing that. So while I'm sure there always will be angst about any increase in expense, if you put it in perspective, if you were in any other country, you would be spending far more for food, which means that you would be spending far less for something else. And I think as consumers, as American families take a look at where they spend their money, they'd have to ask the question, well, if we were spending 20% instead of 7% of our salary on food, where would that other 13% come from? How would it affect our standard of living? I think at that point they will probably tip their hat to farmers and ranchers.
A lot of people grumble still about the idea of farm subsidies, a safety net, but one thing people might not know, I know I didn't until I started doing a lot of research for this panel, is that farm subsidies are fading. I mean, really, farmers are doing so well now, they haven't had to kick in as much, there have been enormous budget cuts. Do you think farm subsidies will eventually wither away? And do you think there's a new model we should be looking at, which is more to do with federally backed insurance program of some sort that makes more sense?
Well, I think first of all, I think we have to make a commitment to farmers and ranchers to have a safety net. And the reason we have to have a safety net, there are fires, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, and floods. All of those have occurred in the United States this year. All of them have impacted in a very serious way farmers and ranchers, and in some cases have wiped out their entire crop. People have to understand that it's not as inexpensive as it once was to put a crop in the ground, which means that if you have a tough year, it's not like the old days where you could probably get through a tough year and still survive. Because it's so expensive to put a crop in the ground, if you have a tough year, if you do not have a safety net, it may be the last year that you farm. And that's important to know because we've seen a shrinking amount of our people, of our population in rural areas. I'm concerned about that. We're at our lowest percentage in rural America in our history. And I think there's a strong value system that is connected to those who live and work and raise their families in rural America. So I think we obviously are looking for ways in which we can provide a safety net against those natural disasters. Secondly, farmers don't have as much control over the market. It's not like they can dictate the price themselves individually for what they get. And so it's important, I think, for us to recognize the safety net needs to be in place. Now, what does that safety net look like? I do think it will obviously involve some kind of crop insurance program, a strongly supported, broad-based crop insurance program. Our programs work pretty well for many commodities, but not for all commodities. Secondly, even though you have crop insurance, and even though you might be able to afford the maximum amount of insurance, there's still a gap between what crop insurance can protect and what you may have at risk. And so I think it's important to have a disaster program that sort of overlays and supports the crop insurance program. And that's the concern I have because we're rapidly approaching October 1st of this year. And when we do, the disaster programs that are in play today will go out of existence. They expire. They expire because Congress, when they established the 2008 Farm Bill, did not adequately and fully fund those programs through the length of the Farm Bill. So that means not only do we have to figure out ways to continue or renew those programs, but we also have to identify the resource that's going to be used to pay for them. And in a constrained resource environment, that means tough calls and tough choices.
That does not sound like a great discussion to be having right now on a Capitol Hill. I don't envy you.
It's a tough discussion, but you know, we at USDA are looking at ways in which we can do a better job, better stewardship of scarce resources. How do we leverage those resources? How do we create new ways to get benefits to farmers? Take conservation, for example. You know, I know that farmers and ranchers like our conservation programs. I know that they recognize that there probably will be fewer dollars in those conservation programs because that's one place where Congress will probably look. But we can still get that job done by leveraging private resources, and we can work with regulatory agencies to maybe encourage some kind of regulatory certainty in exchange for investments that farmers and ranchers make with those conservation dollars. So in exchange for their investment, they get an assurance that there's not going to be a regulatory action on their farm for a period of time. I think if we could create that kind of opportunity, we would still see a lot of investment in conservation, still see the environmental impacts and the job growth that comes from conservation.
Job of a government official these days has to be a lot more flexible and deft.
Well, this is a challenging time. Yeah. You know, there are two ways you can look at this budget reduction. You can sort of mope around and start complaining about the fact that there's going to be less resources, or you can see this as a challenge to reshape an agency or department, to modernize it, to bring it into the 21st century. And I think there's no question that at least at USDA we have a grand opportunity to do that, and we're going to try to seize that opportunity.
You know, one of the things that I've seen some critics say about your department and the president's attitude toward agriculture is that you're trying to embrace everything, big agriculture, organic farms, and everything in between, and that, you need to pick sides. Why aren't you just coming down on one side or the other? But you've argued diversity makes sense in this business.
Diversity makes sense for the following reason. I was a mayor of a small town, or at least I thought it was a small town. It was a town of 8,000 folks. When I became mayor, I asked the question why people were living in communities of smaller size. I actually went to the towns of Salem, Iowa, and Hillsborough, who have far less than Mount Pleasant did. I asked the residents, why are you living in those towns? They said, well, we don't really want to live in a big city like Mount Pleasant. We don't want to live in a town of 8,000. We would prefer to live in a town of 1,000 people. Everyone has a different preference. Everyone has a different choice. Everyone is comfortable with a different size and a different type of operation. We ought not to be discouraging those opportunities because each one of those folks helps to continue to populate and support not only the rural economy, but all of the services and important aspects of quality of life
if you have more families living in rural America, then you have more families supporting rural schools. And those schools do a better job, hopefully over time, of making sure that those youngsters are well educated because they have more support. You're supporting the local hospital so it stays in business. So to me, it isn't about picking winners and losers. It's about essentially saying, how can USDA provide opportunities to support every level of agriculture, because it is supporting overall growth and prosperity in rural communities. If you understand the division of farming in this country, you know that 200,000 farmers produce 85% of what we consume. That's less than 1/10 of 1%. There are another 1.8, 1.9 million folks who farm, who produce something but sell a lot less than the large operations. But they still provide a valuable contribution to rural life. So we ought to be looking for ways to maximize their income opportunities and to leverage their entrepreneurship as well. So I don't really see it as having to choose. I see it as trying to figure out how do we help all aspects of agriculture, because in the end they all help us.
How critical is the role of government regulation in this industry? I mean, you hear a lot of complaints from agriculture about how constraining it can be. You know, more or less, as you talk about reshaping, you know, the Department of Agriculture, is that something that you think should change?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think, first of all, we have to do a better job of educating people about what regulations are in fact in place and are being proposed, because oftentimes what I find is there is a lack of understanding or a lack of appreciation for precisely what is being proposed. Secondly, I think folks who are putting their assets at risk really do deserve to have some greater degree of certainty that if they take certain steps, they're not going to be told after the fact that those steps were inadequate or insufficient, that there wasn't enough done, and now they have to invest more, they have to invest it in a different way. So I really think we, in terms of regulations, need to provide greater certainty, and I think we need to do a better job of making sure that folks are sitting down at the table and fully understanding what is being proposed and why it's being proposed. And then I think it's incumbent upon us to listen very carefully to concerns that are being expressed by folks in the field in terms of how a proposed regulation might impact their business, and if necessary and appropriate, make adjustments to that regulation to reflect an understanding of the difficulties. Oftentimes that's not done. Oftentimes we see things as an adversarial circumstance. You know, I don't know. I guess this is just my attitude. I think we have had far too much adversarial confrontation in this country at every level. And I think it's about time that we realize that this country needs us to come together, needs us to find consensus, no matter how difficult that might be, that our kids and the future of our children depend on us getting our act together. We don't, and frankly, can't afford the luxury of confrontation. We have got to find consensus.
And well, finally, I wanted to ask you, you know, one thing there was some consensus about on this last panel was the need for a budget for research. That's, you know, the research about the future of agriculture, that, you know, having some independent research was critical, and a lot of concern about how that can happen in budget cutting times. How important do you think that is, and how much time do you spend, you know, looking at the big view, the future?
Well, I've actually talked to the President and written the President about this issue, and I think those who are concerned about it have a reason to be concerned. There have been aspects of our research commitment that have increased significantly over the last several years in the health arena, but not as much so in the agricultural productivity arena. Here's what we risk. The research is fairly clear that when you begin to flatline your commitment to agricultural research, you will also flatline the productivity of agriculture. In the last half of the 20th century, agricultural productivity was 4 times that of the general economy. In other words, our farmers and ranchers were operating in terms of productivity 4 times more so than the rest of the economy. A tremendous story that allows us now to have a wide variety of opportunities in rural America from agricultural production, including exports, including job creation tied to exports. That will not be able to continue, nor will we be able to meet the moral demand of trying to feed 9, 7, 8, 9 billion people in this world unless we continue to find ways to be more productive with the land we have. There's not going to be more and more land available for agricultural production. If anything, we have to be careful to protect what we have from development. So that means we really have to be careful and we have to be thoughtful about how we can use and create more with less. That is absolutely tied to research. And my hope is that people understand that in these tight budget times, the one place that we ought not to reduce is in this research area in a significant way, because you will, in essence, be crippling your capacity to grow in the future. And I think what we want to do is we want to get people to work today, but we also want to build a solid foundation for sustained growth in the future in an agriculture that requires additional research.
All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you.
The food dialogues will continue. We're going to take a 10-minute break, but again, don't go away. We have a lot more to talk about.